This segment is on calcium homeostasis in the body and how the hormones can affect the level of calcium ion concentrations in the blood. So first we're going to look at what calcium homeostasis is. And calcium homeostasis would be if the ion concentration of calcium in the blood is between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter. So that's normal. And there are 3 different hormones that can help to keep the calcium levels in blood at this level, and they would be the parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, and calcitonin. So we're going to talk about all 3 of those hormones. So to begin with, we'll talk about if there is a disturbance in the calcium levels. And again, we're talking about calcium blood levels, or the calcium ion concentration in the blood. So we can say that there's a disturbance. On one side, we could say that the disturbance is that the blood calcium levels start to decline. And we'll talk about what happens in that situation. And on the other hand, we can also talk about what happens if the blood calcium levels start to increase. In both of those cases, if the blood calcium levels decline below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter, or if the calcium levels increase above 11 milligrams per deciliter, now we're out of homeostasis. So the body has to figure out exactly what it's going to do in order to restore homeostasis. So first of all, we'll look at what happens if the blood calcium levels start to decline and the calcium levels start to go below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. If this happens, the parathyroid glands will be stimulated. The parathyroid glands secrete a hormone that's called parathyroid hormone or parathormone. And this parathyroid hormone has several effects. If you remember when we were talking about calcium levels in an earlier chapter, when we were talking about bones, we said that calcium, when we look at their homeostasis, we want to look at 3 different areas. We want to look at the bone, the kidney, the intestines. If the parathyroid hormone is secreted, we're going to have changes occurring at the bone, the kidney, and the intestine. At the kidneys, we will have an increased reabsorption of calcium. That means we're bringing more calcium into the body. As the blood gets filtered through the kidneys, the calcium is going to be reabsorbed back into the body. If we look at the bone, what happens in the bone, the calcium levels are declining. We need to get those calcium levels back up. The parathyroid hormone will trigger an increase in osteoclast activity. So it'll increase the osteoclasts, not in a direct way, in more of an indirect way, but nonetheless, if the osteoclasts are increased, then they will be tearing down more bone, taking the calcium out of the bone, and putting it back into the blood. At the same time, it will be decreasing the activity, we think, of the osteoblasts. And then, of course, at the intestines, there's something else that's going to happen at the intestines. The parathyroid hormone will stimulate calcitriol to be secreted from the kidney. And calcitriol then will stimulate the intestines to absorb the calcium that you're ingesting. So at the intestines, we get calcium absorption. Okay, and ultimately what that does then, the calcium levels back to range between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter because we've just increased the levels of calcium. All right, let's look at a different scenario though. Let's look at if the blood calcium levels start to increase. So now we're going above the 11 milligrams per deciliter. This also isn't a great thing for the body. We need to keep those calcium levels in that normal range. So if in that case, if the blood calcium levels start to increase, we need to bring the calcium levels back down. And again, we're going to be looking at those same areas. We're going to look at the bone to see what is happening at the bone to help the calcium levels go back down. And at the kidneys, how is that going to help the calcium levels decrease? And at the intestines, what's going to happen there that's going to help the calcium levels decrease? So if we look at it, the blood calcium levels are increasing and we need to have them decrease. We have this hormone that's called calcitonin that is released from the thyroid gland, and calcitonin then will decrease the levels of calcium in the blood to bring it back to the 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. All right, so what does calcium do to these three different areas? First of all, in bone, calcitonin will stimulate the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts lay down the osteoid, which is an immature bone matrix, and then that immature bone matrix has to be calcified, so calcium is pulled out of the tissues and packed into the bone, and therefore we are decreasing the level of calcium in the tissues and in the blood to do that. All right, well, what happens at the kidney then? We're going to have an increased excretion of calcium by the kidneys, meaning when the blood comes through the kidneys and the calcium gets filtered into the kidney, instead of the kidney reabsorbing that back into the body, the calcium will be excreted out in urine. So we get increased excretion at the kidneys. So those are two things that will happen, and the other thing is that we're not going to have calcitriol being released, so we're going to get a little less absorption at the intestines. If we have a disturbance in the calcium levels, meaning the calcium levels change, that either goes below 8.5 or above 11 milligrams per deciliter, the body has ways that it can bring the blood calcium levels back to this range.